which is probably a wise decision, given the fact that most people consider independence to be a bit of a distraction from the main issues facing us right now. Um, so, yeah, I think well done them on a relatively sound strategy for this election. In general, the SNP take a very leftist view on things, a very green stance on many issues, including welfare, climate change, transport, healthcare, and the economy in general. They have this quite left-leaning swing, and I would say that they're a nationalist party dedicated to national independence, but they're hardly right-wing about it. They're certainly more left-wing than Labour, and they take a lot from Scandinavian models of politics, which all tend to be relatively left-leaning. So on to their specific pledges. I've used the categories that Evan Edinger used to kind of divide up their policies. Some are mixed around a bit. I will try my best to identify which policies are more specifically pledges to fight their corner in Westminster, and which policies are actually them deciding to take action once they come into government. So I'll try and do that as we go along. So starting with transport, their pledges revolve largely around gaining more authority for Scotland, particularly taking their taxes that are raised in Scotland in order to create greener, more accessible transport networks. Outside of these demands, their pledges for action involve simply maintaining their pre-existing policies, such as free transport for under 22s and over 60s. The over 60s one obviously is a UK-wide thing. And they have been keeping peak train fares in check for quite a few years now. They've ensured that there's no such thing essentially as a peak rail fare. The peak tickets are sold at the same price as regular tickets. They do want to push for the improvement of their rural road network, which, as you can imagine, up in Scotland is pretty tough to maintain. There's a lot of crazy weather up here, a lot of difficult places to do construction. So they do want to increase their road network, despite the fact they're more of a green party. But again, this is dependent on funds from Westminster, as is the idea of bringing Scottish Rail, the Scottish Rail network, into government control. Now, this Labour have a policy pledge to nationalise the rail network. Whether or not they would decide to give Scotland the Scottish portion of that is certainly up for debate. I somehow very much doubt it, considering they are not pro-Scottish independence, and if it were the SNP in power, they would be far less likely to give them something anyway. Who knows? So next we have Brexit. Obviously, Scotland want to rejoin the EU. Scotland generally voted for staying within the EU during the referendum in 2020. The Brexit situation has hit Scotland very hard, particularly in their fishing areas and just overall funding. They used to get quite a lot from the EU, and now they don't. And Scotland, I think, generally feels quite betrayed by Britain, particularly that their referendum on Scottish independence was based on a presumption that they would remain within the EU, that they then voted to stay within the EU, but the rest of Britain decided against Scotland in leaving the EU, and now Scotland is suffering as a result. That referendum for Brexit certainly boosted the support for independence in Scotland. And in general, the SNP have not mentioned anything about Britain joining the EU. Rather, they are simply talking about Scotland and independent Scotland joining the EU. So there isn't even a consideration for pushing Westminster to rejoin the EU. In many ways that might be counterproductive. They would lose their independent support from those that have switched to pro-Scottish independence after British independence from the EU. Moving on to drugs. This seems to be a pretty hot topic at the moment. Every party seems to have a pledge on drugs, and in general, it's there's a big push towards going a bit easier on them. Not all parties are doing that. Reform is still very anti-drugs and believes in increasing prison sentences for criminals, putting them in prison for up to life for dealing and stuff like that. But many parties are going the opposite way. The SNP is certainly one of them. So they would stop, putting people in prison for being caught with very small quantities of personal amounts of drugs. They would want to bring, just like the Greens, actually, they would want to bring drug addiction and these kind of more extreme bad use of drugs into the remit, into the under the control of the health care system, the health ministry. They consider addiction to be a medical issue rather than a criminal issue. So they would certainly push to decriminalise many drugs, just like many other countries, including America and various other European countries, have been going of late. Germany, perhaps the most recently. Further more into the drugs issue, Glasgow Council recently approved, I think it was last September, they recently approved the construction of a drug safe room, which is where these are facilities where drug addicts will be able to come in off the street or from anywhere and be able to take drugs in a safe, secure environment. Whether or not you agree they should be taking the drugs in the first place, of course, probably not. The environments in which they do them in can be pretty disgusting, pretty unhealthy, and healthy in various ways, whether they're open to manipulation or control, or whether it's simply dirty and unhygienic. So the SNP will push on these plans to open these facilities, which will also allow scientists to collect data, medical practitioners to create long-term treatment programs for drug addicts, which in my opinion is, whether it will be a success or not is not certain, but I do think that doing something like this is far better than the alternatives of either doing nothing at all or enforcing legal penalties upon these people. That just does nothing. It's well known you can access drugs far easier in prisons than out in the streets these days, and it just creates that in-out cycle of drug addicts, which has proven to not work for decades now. When it comes to housing, the SNP have been surprisingly quite quiet on this issue. According to Evan's video that I mentioned earlier, most parties made quite a big bang of brandishing, how many houses they're going to build when they come into office. So the SNP generally, they didn't mention any targets, although they do have some from their current government. They didn't mention any in their manifesto, which is quite likely because they've actually, in the past couple of years, the past 2 years, they have cut into this housing budget, moving money from it to put in other places, which many people have said that it's going to certainly harm their ability to meet these targets. So that's almost certainly why they haven't put this into their manifesto as a pledge. They are pushing for new regulations, easing up regulations for construction to allow much more renovation and repurposing of existing buildings to help with the housing crisis that we are certainly in at the moment. They would also want to introduce a rent-to-buy scheme, which would allow long-term tenants, I think over 30 years. It would give them a right and a financial capacity to be able to buy the house that they've lived in, which is, in many circumstances could be a family house or, something that they've gotten used to. And of course, they do like to remind us of the number of houses, affordable housing in particular, that they have built in their term of office, which is a not insubstantial number, 128,000 affordable homes, which is, I would say, a very large amount, particularly compared to similar sized regions in England or across the UK, similar sized economic regions and people number regions. I think that's a pretty high number there, because it's specifically affordable housing, not just housing overall. And this is the main thing that we are lacking in the UK. So moving on to healthcare, the SNP talk a lot about healthcare. I haven't gone into a massive amount of detail in this area, but they will demand that Westminster increase the yearly NHS budget, overall budget, to 10 billion, an increase of 10 billion year on year, to help dig the NHS out of their hole that they find themselves in, which, I'm not sure whether throwing more money at the system is entirely the right answer to this. But it's a decent point to make that they support the NHS in that way, I suppose. Scotland would be seen to benefit quite substantially if Westminster were to put more money in the NHS in general. I think they'll be looking at about £1 billion extra. Plus, they want to bring in other money from Westminster to improve the NHS in Scotland. And of course, they talked about their pre-existing policies, one of which is free prescriptions. They've had this for quite a long time, as far as I'm aware. It's certainly very popular with many people that I've met. It seems like a very good deal, particularly seeing how much people pay for prescriptions in England. I'm quite a big fan of it, although it's not exactly means tested. It is just a blanket free prescriptions for everybody. But I think that's a pretty decent policy right there. They'd also they want to push the war on smoking and the banning of single-use vape pens. As a smoker myself, I'm not sure how I feel about that. I do want to quit, and if there is help for me to quit, then I guess that's a good thing. Much like their drugs policy as well, they are pushing for gambling addiction to be brought into the healthcare system, or to be made a major public health issue. And they would want to reform policies on the advertising of gambling, which I noticed recently. Actually, there was an advert that I saw. I don't see too many TV adverts for some kind of online betting firm, and I just thought it was surprisingly appealing. Not really to me, but I can certainly see how it would be appealing to a huge number of people, and a very diverse group of people in the advert, and really connected it to kind of daily life and regular things, and kind of made it seem like a kind of casual bit of fun, which for some people it can be, I'm sure, but it's certainly a major cause of a lot of issues, financial and domestic issues in the UK, and I would certainly advocate some kind of reform of the advertising laws in the UK. And they would also want to tax casinos and betting firms a lot more than they already are. Which I think is a pretty decent approach to gambling. Now, probably the biggest issue in their manifesto was economics. It's hard for anybody to avoid economics, and it affects so many areas that, of course, it's going to be a major issue. So obviously they are pledging to demand much more money from Westminster, in the sense of demanding their own money. So various, they just want financial independence. If a tax is raised in Scotland, they want to keep that tax and be able to spend it themselves. And they did a lot of, reiterating the policies they've already done. Apparently they've made 1.5 billion from income tax reforms, and the way they're using that money is considered a lot. They're claiming a lot better than England, which it seems in many ways it is, by having much higher childcare subsidies. You get more child benefit, particularly compared to England, and they would also want to cut the 2-child cap on child support, which is something that I was kind of aware of. If you have more than 2 children, you don't get any more money for those children, which, I'm not a big fan of. I think if you have more kids, it costs you more, and if you need more money to feed them, to clothe them, then to pay for school uniforms and such, then I think you should get a bit more money. They also said, and on that point, both Labour and the Tories have said that there's now no more money to cancel that cap on child support, which seems to indicate that neither of them think that it's a very good policy. Labour, I know, didn't think it was a good policy, and before they called for it to be scrapped, but now both of them have said there's just no money to re-implement more child benefit out there. The SNP, they've also frozen council tax. They've cancelled out the infamous bedroom tax, where if you had more bedrooms than people, I think, empty bedrooms, you were taxed a bit more in your council tax. And they've extended the free school meal programme, which I didn't look into, but I'm assuming there's an issue with free school meals from Westminster at the moment that they are trying to, or they have, cancelled out. So they plan to push Westminster, obviously, to give them their tax and fuel duties, just another form of tax that they want to keep. They want to reform the energy sector and help subsidise energy costs for the Highlands and Islands, which I think you can imagine is a very tough and expensive place to get energy to, and they do have high bills up there as a result. They want Westminster to match the SNP's pledge of 500 million, £500 million, to revitalise the northeast of Scotland. So it's kind of Aberdeenshire and around this area, which has been hit quite hard by the general decline in North Sea oil operations. So they'd want to have Westminster either match or even give more money towards the revitalisation of this community. They'd also want to see an increase in housing benefits, and they'd want to ensure people can afford basic utilities and food, for example, with a essentials guarantee for everybody in the UK, or everybody in Scotland at least, which would ensure that they can pay for these basics. And they want increased powers over VAT, so that they can overhaul the VAT system. In particular, a comment I saw was that they think it's ridiculous that caviar is not charged VAT, but sunscreen is. Whereas, for most people, I think sunscreen is much more of an essential than caviar. Which seems to make sense. So they also want to back off from nuclear energy in general, which is a debatable subject for sure. And they're demanding 28 billion from Westminster to invest in green energy in Scotland. They would ensure that these government contracts granted them equity stakes in these projects, so that in the future the government can gain dividends from that. Plus, as the projects are being rolled out and built, the government would have much more oversight over these projects and be able to make sure that there are no runaway costs and bills. which, given the government's record, is certainly no guarantee of that. But I think this is a great idea, particularly in Scotland, but all over the UK. There's plenty of space for the increase of green energies. We're an island nation. We get a surprising amount of sun for where we are. We have a lot of opportunity to capitalise on green energy of various different sorts, wave energy, a lot of wind here. So it makes sense for Scotland, I think, to really capitalise upon that. Scotland has a lot of space and it has a lot of capacity to invest and to reap the rewards from green energy up here. Of course, as part of the bigger debate if green energy is worth it and that, but I tend to think it is. We'll see. Furthermore, their plans for when they actually enter government, things that they would act upon, which, although I've said that, they still would demand more money for fishing from Westminster and for farming. Apparently there's no promise of subsidising farmers in Scotland after 2025, so they try and ensure that. And after Brexit, the fishing industry was completely decimated up here, despite the fact they hold about 90%, I think, of the UK's fish stocks in Scottish waters. They've received very little benefit from the government to try and compensate for the very bad deal we got for fishing in the Brexit deals that were made. Particularly, I think Boris Johnson and Theresa May were involved in those deals. So what they would do is they'd increase tax on large corporations and large companies. They quite strongly believe that they should be taxing them more and distributing that wealth. They would cut VAT on the hospitality and tourism industries, which are suffering quite a lot at the moment with the general increase in cost of living, cost of food, cost of energy, cost of staff, various things. Tourism and hospitality have been hit pretty hard, so they'd cut VAT on them, and also on electric charging facilities to try and encourage them to try and encourage the use of electric vehicles. They would also, crack down on classic tax avoidance, tax evasion, which everybody says they want to and they will. Not many people actually have the guts and the balls to do it, because these are very powerful men and corporations they're dealing with here. A bit more powerful than politicians, it seems, quite a lot of the time. They want to remove VAT exemptions that private schools have at the moment. This is on top of the fact that they've already taken charitable status away from them. Which again is all about equity, isn't it? It's a very left-wing policy. And they'd continue to strengthen workers' rights, reforming sick pay, reinforcing the union's rights to strike, which I think have been cut quite substantially under the Conservative government, and in general unions have lost a lot of power, particularly with Labour kind of downgrading them within their internal party hierarchy. The unions have a lot less say and a lot less influence and a lot less votes than they used to about the hierarchy and who runs the Labour Party. All classic left-wing stuff right there, workers' rights. They would also want to equalise child benefits for under 25. So this is something I didn't even know, I wasn't aware of, that apparently if you are under the age of 25 in the UK and you have a child, both as a single parent or as two parents, you get 25% less money from your childcare benefits support package. This is based on the assumption that under 25s are living with their parents, and thus the overall cost of living is less for them. I think this is a bit of a ridiculous policy, that the age 25 is just an arbitrary number picked out of thin air. I'm quite shocked at that policy, to be honest with you. It's tough being young I'm not really including myself in that, but I'm young enough to still find it tough, I'd say. But yeah, I mean, that just seems ridiculous, particularly child support. They're removing child support from young people who always have generally lower paid jobs. They do not have their own homes. They're renting rather than owning homes. It seems a bit ridiculous. If you want people to buy their own homes, you give them more money, even if they are living with their parents, and so on and so forth. So they would cancel that one out. And they also have an idea that they want to implement, which is to increase the parental leave that is allowed for new parents. They would add another 12 weeks of fraternity leave, adding, totaling, I think, 64 weeks in total of overall parental leave. Those 12 weeks would have to be used by the father, which is an attempt by them to try and reverse these older school traditions of the woman always being left to look after the kids, to ensure that kids get some more father time, one-on-one father time. I think this is a relatively decent policy, and so essentially these extra 12 weeks would only be paid out if it's the father using them, which I think it may be some kind of left-wing social engineering situation going on, but it's not being forced upon them, and I think the benefits of that far outweigh the costs of that. And finally, immigration. They would increase the list of desirable occupations, where we have a list of occupations that the government decides we need in the UK. They would increase that list to further increase the amount of targeted immigration that we have, immigrants coming in with the relevant skills that the British economy needs, that we don't have enough of within the UK already. And they would also allow the families of care workers to come in to the UK, which I'm assuming was banned or stopped by the Conservative government. If that was the case, I think I can see the too many immigrants argument right here, but I mean, care work is in general one of the hardest jobs out there. It's a ridiculous situation we have in care. I think it's a real stain on Britain, and there are many of them, I think, at the moment, but care work in particular is one of them. They are massively understaffed, underpaid. The management systems are awful. The conditions that the elderly are kept in are awful. The conditions that the workers have to work in are awful, and it just seems to be blatantly ignored, or at least just battered around and nothing ever done about it by both governments and the public. It seems like there's perhaps members of the public do care, but they're not doing anything to push Westminster to do anything about it. It's a tough situation. So and I think most care workers these days in the UK are immigrants, because they're more tolerant to working in these conditions, and they work harder, so they can work like 1.5 to 2 people, which is what you need when you're running on a skeleton crew in a care home. So the idea that you'd stop them having their families come in, even though other professions, other visas would allow you to bring your family in, I think is pretty harsh. So that was the rundown there of the main points of the manifesto. So I must say, having done this, I understand that better. I do understand why the SNP. Let's restart that.